Meridian Point wasn't on any tourist map. That's not a metaphor. The station literally didn't appear on standard navigation charts, not the civilian ones anyway. You could cross half the Kestrel belt and never know it existed. It showed up on older freight routes, the kind that predated the coalition rerouting, and even then it was listed under a different designation. Way Station Gamma 9, maintenance status, minimal. Which honestly was generous. I'd been there 3 months by the time it happened. I was the mechanic, the only mechanic, technically, since old Farouk had retired back to Ganymede and nobody had seen fit to replace him. The station administrator, a reed-thin woman named Corinne Belshaw who communicated almost exclusively through written notices and the occasional pointed look, had promoted me by default. My pay hadn't changed. My title had, technically, but since I printed it on absolutely nothing, it didn't matter much. Meridian Point was a layover station. Ships stopped, refueled, filed transit documents, rested their crews, and left. The commerce was minimal, a small trading floor where you could pick up whatever was cheapest in the local sector, a diner that served approximately 4 things well and everything else adequately, a medical bay staffed by a doctor named Pruitt who had opinions about everyone's diet and the personality of a particularly stern schoolteacher. The population at any given time was maybe 200 people. Transients were always outnumbered by transients. The permanent staff, dock workers, admin clerks, maintenance crew like me, we were the constants, the ones who held the rhythm of the place. We knew each other in the way that people know each other when they have no choice, completely. I had a workshop on level 3. That's where most of this story happens, so let me describe it properly. It was a long, low-ceilinged room that smelled of machine oil and something like burnt coffee, because I kept a pot running most of the day, and the ventilation in that section had never quite worked the way it was supposed to. The walls were lined with tool racks, some organized, some not, depending on how the previous week had gone. There were 2 heavy work tables bolted to the floor, a diagnostic terminal that was exactly 3 software updates behind current, and a collection of things I'd been meaning to fix for months and hadn't yet. I liked the workshop. It was honest. Everything in there was either broken or fixed. There was nothing in between, no ambiguity. You either solved the problem or you didn't. That clarity meant something to me. Life on a deep transit way station doesn't offer much of it. Chapter 2. The Little Girl with the Burned Hand. She walked in on a Thursday. I know it was Thursday because I was in the middle of the weekly diagnostic cycle on the fuel modulator array. A job I only ran on Thursdays because it took exactly the right kind of patience, and I only had that once a week, apparently. She was small, 6, maybe 7. Human, clearly, the rounded features, the proportional limbs, the way she walked with that slight hesitation that kids get when they've been told not to touch something and they're fighting the instinct. Her hair was very dark, almost black, cut short and practical, and her eyes were this unusual color, pale gold, almost amber, and I remember noticing that because it wasn't common. Not unheard of genetically, but not common. She was wearing a plain gray outfit, the kind of thing you'd put a child in for travel. Functional, comfortable, nothing that would identify her. She was holding something against her chest. Both hands wrapped around it. The kind of grip a kid uses when they're carrying something precious and breakable, and they know it. I looked up from the diagnostic terminal. She was standing in the doorway just looking at me, not scared exactly, assessing. "Workshop's not really for kids," I said, not unkindly. "Did you get turned around?" "No," she said. Her voice was calm, precise even for a child. "You fix things." "Yeah, I do. Can you fix this?" She walked forward, unhesitating once she'd made the decision, and placed the object on the edge of my work table. Unwrapped her hands from it with visible reluctance, like it cost her something to let it go. I leaned forward to look. It was a bird. Mechanical, clearly, not real, not alive. maybe 20 centimeters long, wings folded against its body. The feathers were some kind of thin metal alloy I didn't immediately recognize, layered in overlapping segments that must have created a realistic rippling effect when the thing was operational. The body was a matte silver with these faint, iridescent markings along the wings, the kind that shift color depending on the angle of the light. It was, without question, the most beautiful piece of mechanical engineering I had ever seen. It was also clearly broken. One wing was bent at a wrong angle. Several of the feather segments along the breast had been displaced, and one of them was darkened, heat damage from the look of it. There was a faint smell of scorching around the whole thing, the same kind of smell you get when an electrical component has taken a surge. "What happened to it?" I asked. The girl's jaw tightened slightly, just slightly. "I was carrying it when the access port door closed wrong. The environmental seal fired and the charge went through the corridor." She paused. "I was holding it. The surge went through the metal." She held up her left hand. There was a burn there along the palm and the inner fingers, reddish, clearly recent. Not serious, but real. It had to have hurt. "You got burned trying to protect it," I said. She nodded. I looked at the bird again, then back at her. "What's your name?" She considered whether to tell me. That's the thing I remember, the deliberateness of it. This was not a child who answered questions automatically. "Sora," she said. "Sora, I'm Marsh. Want me to take a look?" She nodded again, sat herself down on the stool I kept by the second work table, uninvited, completely comfortable with the decision, and watched me. Chapter 3: What the Bird Was. I worked on it for 3 hours before I understood what I was looking at. The first hour was just careful examination. I've learned not to rush with unfamiliar mechanisms. You can cause more damage than you fix if you start pulling things apart before you know what everything does. So I moved slowly, mapped the structure, took a small magnifying lens from the second drawer and worked over every segment of feathers. The engineering was extraordinary. I've been a mechanic most of my adult life. I've worked on coalition defense platforms, on commercial freight engines, on the kind of ancient equipment you find on deep transit stations that nobody's bothered to replace because it still technically works. I have an appreciation for good design that goes beyond aesthetic. I understand it mechanically, functionally, the way a thing fits together. This bird was not human-made. That took me about 40 minutes to accept. I kept finding reasons to dismiss the conclusion: custom manufacturing, experimental design, maybe a specialty workshop somewhere that catered to that kind of artisanal level of craft. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. The tolerances on the feather segments were finer than anything our manufacturing technology produced. The internal structure, visible through the small damage window the surge had created, used an arrangement of micro-components I didn't have a name for. The material was the final confirmation. I ran a basic surface analysis with the diagnostic probe, the kind that just gives you the elemental breakdown of what you're touching. The alloy came back as partially unidentifiable. Not untested, not rare, unidentifiable. The probe literally returned a partial result, flagged with a notation I'd only ever seen on academic documents: composition outside known cataloged materials. I sat back in my chair and looked at the bird for a while. Then I looked at Sora. She was still on the stool. She'd found a small piece of wire at some point and was bending it idly in her fingers, not nervously, just the way a kid occupies her hands when she's waiting. She was watching me with those amber eyes, calm and patient. "This is old," I said, not a question. "Yes," she said. "And it's not from here, not from Earth, not from anything in the coalition systems." She tilted her head slightly, just a small movement, but it was a deliberate one, acknowledging the truth of what I'd said without technically confirming it. 7 years old, maybe, and already she had the vocabulary of someone used to not saying things directly. I should have thought harder about what that meant. "Do you know how it works?" I asked. "Some." Mother explained some of it to me. "Your mother made this." Something moved across her face at that, a flicker of something complicated. "It was given to her," Sora said. "A long time ago. She gave it to me when I was born." I nodded slowly. "Does your mother know you're here?" "She knows I'm on the station. She doesn't know where on the station." There was no deception in her voice when she said it, just clarity. This was a child who had clearly learned, very early, that honesty was more efficient than the alternative. "She'll be looking for you soon," I said. "Probably," Sora agreed. "Can you fix it?" I looked at the bird again. "I don't know," I said, and that was the most honest answer I'd given anyone in months. Chapter 4: The Work. I fixed it. It took the rest of that day and most of the following morning, and it required me to improvise more than I was comfortable with, but I fixed it. The wing was the straightforward part, relatively speaking. The metal was unlike anything I'd worked with, but the underlying mechanics of a jointed wing aren't so different regardless of what the joint is made of. I straightened the bent segment using a vise set adjusted to minimum pressure, worked the alloy back toward its original curve the way you'd work expensive metal, slowly, with careful force, letting it settle rather than forcing it. The feather segments were harder. The displaced ones could be repositioned. I used a micro tool from my precision kit and worked them back into the interlocking pattern they were clearly designed for. The scorched one was the problem. Heat damage that deep. It had affected the underlying circuitry in the segment, whatever passed for circuitry in this thing. I could see the conducting pathway had been disrupted. Here's where I made a decision that I've thought about many times since. I could have stopped. I could have told Sora honestly that the damaged segment was beyond what I could repair without replacement parts, that I didn't know where to get replacement parts, that she'd need to take the bird to someone with access to wherever this thing came from. I chose not to do that. Partly because she was a child, and the look on her face when she'd put the bird on my table, that careful, controlled expression that was working very hard to conceal how much this thing mattered to her, had gotten to me. I'm not immune to that. I don't claim to be. But partly because it was the most interesting engineering problem I'd encountered in years, and that's just the truth. I bridged the damaged conducting pathway using a material I'd been experimenting with for about 8 months, a conductive composite I'd developed in my spare time by layering industrial-grade conductive mesh with a thermal buffer compound. It was experimental. I wasn't sure it would work with whatever this material was. I wasn't sure it would create the same kind of connection the original had. I connected it, sealed the segment as best I could, and set the bird in the padded cradle I'd improvised from a packing liner. Then I looked for the activation point. It took another hour to find it, a small pressure contact point along the bird's sternum, under one of the lower breast segments. When I pressed it, I half expected nothing. What happened instead was this. The bird breathed. I know that sounds wrong. Machines don't breathe. But that's what it looked like. The whole structure expanded very slightly, all the feather segments lifting a fraction and then settled again, like an inhale and an exhale. And then the wings opened. Slowly, deliberately, unfolding with this extraordinary fluidity. Every segment moving in sequence, creating that rippling effect I'd imagined, the iridescent markings catching the workshop light and scattering it in a dozen directions at once. The bird turned its head. It looked at me. I sat very still. "It works," said Sora. I turned. She'd gotten off the stool at some point. I'd been too focused to notice. And she was standing right beside me, both hands pressed flat to her chest like she was holding her heartbeat in. The bird made a sound. Not quite a song. More like a chord, something layered and complex that landed somewhere between music and language, and I felt it in my chest rather than just hearing it with my ears. Sora exhaled. It was the first unguarded thing I'd seen her do. Her whole face changed. That careful composure which, again, I'm describing in a 7-year-old, which is strange to think about even now, it just released. And underneath it was a child who loved something very much and had been afraid she'd lost it. She reached out and the bird stepped onto her wrist. Just stepped onto it like it knew her, like it recognized her. Maybe it did. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it completely. I could hear that. "How did you know to come here?" I asked. She tilted her head again. That small, careful movement. "I watched you," she said. "For 2 days I watched how you worked, how you handled things. You don't break things you're trying to fix." She paused. "A lot of people do. They get impatient." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. She left with the bird perched on her wrist, wings folded back against its body, looking in every way like a living creature. I watched her go and thought, I should find out whose kid that is. I should have thought faster. Chapter 5, The Quiet Before. Nothing happened for 2 days. That's the part of the story that gets left out in faster tellings. The ordinary stretch between the first strange thing and the second one. The part where life continued exactly the way it always had, and I had no reason to think anything was different. I ran diagnostics. I repaired a coolant manifold on a mid-class freighter that had come in for stopover. I had lunch with Pruitt, who told me my blood pressure was fine but my sleep schedule was deplorable. I thought occasionally about the bird, about the material it was made from, the design, the way it had moved, but I chalked it up as a mystery I'd probably never resolve, which is a sentence you make your peace with in this line of work. I didn't see Sora. That wasn't unusual. Transients, even those with children, kept their own schedules. The station was large enough that you could go days without seeing the same face twice. I did notice, peripherally, something I should have paid more attention to. The security routine changed. Meridian Point had a security detail, 5 people, 6 on rotation, coalition standard issue, which meant competent but not extraordinary. They handled the usual docking disputes, the occasional contraband scan, the paperwork-heavy process of verifying transit documents. Starting the day after Sora came to my workshop, they were running tighter perimeter checks. I noticed because the corridor outside my workshop, which security passed maybe once every 4 hours in normal rotation, started seeing patrols every hour and a half. I noticed because Commander Veith, the head of security, a heavy-set Martian-born woman who had the energy of someone who'd been doing this job long enough to be thoroughly done with everyone, looked tight around the eyes in a way she usually didn't. I noticed and I thought, transit dignitary probably, someone important coming through, they get twitchy. It didn't occur to me that the twitchiness had been there since Sora arrived, not until much later. The third morning, I was eating breakfast in the diner when Tomas, one of the dock technicians, a tall, loose-limbed guy from the outer settlement rings, who was one of the closest things I had to a friend on the station, leaned across the table and said, very quietly, "You see the ship that docked last night?" "What ship?" I said. He gave me a look. "Base 7, you didn't walk past Base 7 this morning." "I came up from level 3, why?" He leaned back, turned his coffee cup in his hands. "It's big," he said. "It's big in a way I don't have words for, and it doesn't have any markings." I thought about this. "Military," I said. "Not coalition. Not anything I've ever seen." He paused. "The hull is dark, like actual dark, not just dark-colored, like looking at a hole in the space where a ship should be." "What did they file as?" "Diplomatic transit," he said. "That's all the documentation says. Diplomatic transit, unspecified origin." I sipped my coffee. "Veith, no. Veith is the one who told me. She looked like she'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy." I thought about Sora, about the bird, about material composition outside known cataloged materials. How many crew? I said. Tomas shook his head. Nobody's come off it yet. That's the thing. The ship docked at 200, filed the documentation remotely, and nobody has disembarked. Nobody human, he said. And then he stopped himself, like he'd said more than he meant to. I put my cup down. They came for me 4 hours later. Not violently, not with any obvious threat, but they came for me, and the distinction between that and an arrest is mostly a matter of framing. There were 4 of them. I was in the workshop when they arrived, standing in the doorway in that way that makes it clear the doorway is not, in fact, optional. 3 of them were in armor I didn't recognize. Dark material, not quite black, with a faint structural luminescence along the joints. Tall, very tall, well over 2 meters, and built with a solidity that made the humans in our security detail look like people who'd been trying to lift weights for several years but hadn't committed fully. The 4th was Veith. She looked, if anything, more uncomfortable than Tomas had described. Marsh, she said, can you come with us? Am I being detained? I said, muscle memory. You grow up in certain places, you ask certain questions automatically. No, she said, you're being requested. Requested by who? She opened her mouth, closed it, looked briefly like someone calculating the most precise degree of truth they could safely tell. Someone who wants to thank you, she said, for what you did for her daughter. I looked at the 3 armored figures. They didn't move. They didn't fidget. They didn't shift weight. They just stood there with the absolute stillness of things that are very good at waiting. I took off my work gloves, set them on the table. Sure, I said. Let me lock up. The walk to Bay 7 took 12 minutes. I counted. Not because I was nervous. Well, not only because I was nervous, but because I was doing the only thing that felt useful in that situation, which was paying attention to details. Meridian Point's corridors are wide enough for cargo handling equipment but not spacious by any measure. With 3 2-meter armored figures accompanying you, they feel considerably narrower. I was aware, the whole walk, of being enclosed, not trapped, technically, but enclosed. The figures didn't speak. Neither did Veith, which was unusual for her. She had an opinion about everything, normally. She was the kind of administrator-adjacent personality that fills silences with commentary. The fact that she was silent told me more about the situation than anything else so far. We passed the main trading floor. A few people looked up, saw us, and looked away quickly, that very specific human behavior that says I see something unusual, and I am choosing not to engage with it. We passed the medical bay. I saw the curtain move, Pruett looking out, Pruett watching, recording probably in the way that careful people record things. We reached Bay 7. The door was a standard docking bay door, heavy industrial, 2 meters wide, hydraulic seals. Everything about the door itself was ordinary. What was beyond it was not. The ship filled Bay 7. That sounds obvious. Ships filled docking bays. But Bay 7 was built for large freighters, for the biggest class of commercial vessel that used the station. The bay was enormous by station standards. You could fit a medium apartment complex in it with room to spare. The ship filled it. Not by being too big for the space. It fit, technically, though the clearances were much tighter than usual. But it filled the space in the way that certain objects fill spaces, by having a gravity of presence that extends beyond their physical dimensions, by demanding that everything around them orient toward them. Tomas had been right about the color. It was dark in a way that didn't make immediate visual sense. The hull material absorbed light differently than any surface I'd ever seen, not matte, not reflective, not metallic. It was like looking at a surface that existed at a slight remove from the same dimension everything else occupied. My eyes kept trying to focus, and finding nothing to focus on. The markings were not absent. I could see that now. They were there, but they were in the hull material itself, not on it, visible only from certain angles as variations in that strange light-absorbing texture. Geometric, complex, completely outside any visual language I could identify. It was the most extraordinary and terrifying thing I had ever seen. And at the base of the boarding ramp, waiting, was Sara. She had the bird on her wrist. She saw me, and I watched her face do the same thing it had done in the workshop, that slight softening, that release from the careful composure. A fragment of relief. "You came," she said. "Yeah," I said. "Someone mentioned your mother wanted to thank me." "She does." Sara glanced back at the ramp. "She's not angry, I want you to know that." A pause. "I didn't leave the ship without telling her where I was going, just not exactly." "That's a meaningful distinction," I said. "I know." She looked up at me. "She's going to look very intimidating. Most humans find her very intimidating. I want you to know she's being formal, not threatening." "That's good to know," I said. "Also," Sara added, and her voice was completely matter-of-fact, "she's probably going to offer you something. You should accept it graciously but not excessively." 7 years old. "Good advice," I said. "I know," she said again. And she led me up the ramp. The interior of the ship was not what I expected. Which is a strange thing to say, because I didn't know what I expected. I hadn't had enough reference points to construct an expectation. But whatever ambient image my mind had assembled from science fiction and military briefings, and the collective human imagination of what an alien warship looks like inside, it wasn't this. It was quiet. That was the first thing. The ambient sound of a ship running, the hum of engines, the whisper of life support, the small mechanical language of a vessel in operation. It was all there, but muted and arranged in a way that felt deliberate. Like someone had thought carefully about what sound should feel like in a space where people spent significant time. The corridors were wider than station corridors. The ceiling was high enough that I stopped being aware of it, which is a specific kind of architecturally induced calm I'd only ever felt in large natural spaces before. The light was warm. Not earth-warm, not the yellow spectrum of sunlight I grew up under, but warm in terms of quality. It had depth rather than just brightness. The kind of illumination that renders things in 3 dimensions rather than flattening them. There were crew members. I'd been braced for, I'm not sure, something dramatic, something alien in the movie poster sense. What I found was variety. The crew I passed in the corridors were diverse in a way that took me a moment to fully parse. Some clearly non-human. Yes, structures and proportions that didn't match any species I could immediately identify, though I recognized a few, but not grotesque. Not threatening in their basic form. Just different in the way that everything here was different, which was fundamentally rather than superficially. They noticed me. Some of them glanced at Sara with what looked like familiarity, a nod, or the equivalent, a gesture that read as acknowledgement of someone known and liked. None of them looked surprised to see a human walking through their ship. A few looked curious. Nobody said anything threatening. Sara led me through 3 corridors and to a set of double doors. She stopped. The bird on her wrist made its chord sound again, softer this time. "Ready?" Sara said. I considered the question. "Sure," I said. She touched a panel, the doors opened. She was standing at the far end of the room, looking at a display I couldn't read from the door. My first impression was height. She was tall by human standards, not as tall as the armored figures but closer to that scale than to human normal. My second impression was stillness. The same quality the armored guards had, but in her it didn't read as programmed caution. It read as presence, like she was the still point of whatever room she occupied. She turned. Human in basic form, bilaterally symmetrical, upright head and limbs in the right proportions. but the details were not human. Her coloring was wrong in specific ways. Skin that had a very faint luminescent undertone, visible mostly in the periphery of my vision. Hair the color of deep space at an angle where you can see the density of stars. And her eyes, the same amber gold as Sara's, but brighter, more saturated somehow, like the color had more information in it than eyes usually carry. She was looking at me. I have been looked at by many people over many years. Commanding people, intimidating people, people in crisis, people in authority. I have been looked at by people who were deciding whether to trust me and people who had already decided they didn't. This was different. She was looking at me the way I looked at a mechanism I was trying to understand completely before I touched it. Not cold. Not clinical, but total. Like I was in focus in a way that meant everything else had briefly left the frame. I stood still. There's a thing you learn as a mechanic. Some things respond better when you hold still and let them do what they're going to do. She said something. Not to me, to someone behind me who I hadn't noticed. A smaller figure, one of the crew, who responded and then stepped away. Then she looked at me again. "Your name is Marsh," she said. Her voice was, I'm going to try to be precise here, layered. Like several frequencies of sound were occurring at once, most of them in ranges I was technically hearing, but not consciously processing. The effect was that the words landed with a weight that didn't come from volume. "Yes," I said. "And you're Sara's mother." A fraction of pause. "Yes," she said. And something moved through those amber eyes, something I couldn't name but recognized as genuine. "I'm told you fixed her bird," she said. "Rewired a damaged segment, repositioned some displaced components." I paused. "I improvised the repair material. I don't know how long the bridge will hold, it's not the original conducting medium. If it degrades, I'd need to know what the original is made of to replace it properly." Silence. She was still looking at me. "You are telling me the repair has a possible weakness," she said. "I'm telling you, I don't know the design materials well enough to guarantee the fix. That's honest disclosure. You should know so you can plan for it." I glanced at Sara, who was watching this exchange with that amber-eyed attention. That thing matters to her. Another pause. "Yes," said the woman who was, I would learn shortly, Empress Commander Ilith Vane, sovereign of the Keth Dominion, ruler of 7 star systems, and the most feared military intelligence in 4 quadrants of the known galaxy. "It does." Here's a brief catalog of things I didn't know at that point, and found out later. The Keth Dominion. Not a name that appeared in civilian briefings. Not a name that appeared in publicly available coalition intelligence documents. It appeared in the military access tier above my clearance level, which, as a station mechanic, was essentially 0, and in certain academic papers that discussed the periphery of mapped space with the careful, hedged language of people writing about things they couldn't fully verify. The Keth were not warlike by nature. That's the first thing you have to understand, because the reputation I'm about to describe gives the wrong impression. They were strategic. They were territorial in the way that predators are territorial, not aggressive by default, but absolute when their space was encroached upon. They had fought 3 major conflicts in the last 2 centuries by their calendar. They had won all 3 decisively. Ilith Vane had led the 3rd one. She had been Empress Commander for 17 years. Before that, she'd been a military commander. The records on this were fragmentary even in military access tiers, because the Keth don't document their history in ways that translate easily. But the consensus of what coalition intelligence had pieced together was that she'd never lost a campaign. Never. That word appears in 3 separate intelligence assessments I eventually got to read, each written by people who clearly found it difficult to believe and had checked it repeatedly before including it. The reputation, the military intelligence, the strategy that had made her name into something other commanders used carefully and quietly. None of that was visible in the room. What was visible was a woman who had looked at me with that absolute attention and said yes when I told her the bird mattered to her daughter. Sora was her only child. That I also learned later. The significance of that in Keth culture was something I only partially understood from the reading I did afterward. Children were not common in a society with a Keth lifespan. An heir was a statement about the future. What you chose to give an heir was a reflection of what you believed the future should hold. She had given Sora a bird made from unclassifiable material, woven with a conducting pathway so sophisticated it could only be described as music when it worked. The first thing she taught her daughter was what was worth protecting. I didn't know any of this while I was standing in that room. She sat down. That was the surprising thing. The way she moved from standing to sitting was easy, deliberate, like every physical action she took was considered rather than automatic. She gestured toward a second seat across the room's central table. I sat. Sora settled herself on a low shelf along the wall, bird on her wrist, watching us both with the expression of someone attending a performance they'd arranged. You said you improvised the repair material, Aleph Vane said. Yes, I've been developing a conductive composite industrial mesh layered with thermal buffer compound. It conducts reasonably well across temperature ranges. It held on the test activation. I paused. But the original conducting pathway in that feather segment used something I can't identify. My diagnostic probe couldn't characterize the material. If I'm bridging between two different materials, there are long-term compatibility questions I can't answer without knowing what the original is. She was quiet for a moment. You ran a material analysis on it, she said. I needed to understand what I was working with. I wasn't trying to reverse engineer anything. I just needed to know enough not to cause more damage. I met her eyes. The light in them was unsettling in a specific way, like looking at something that was fully awake in a dimension my perception didn't quite cover. I can give you the probe log if you want it. All I got was a partial composition flagged as outside cataloged materials. And this didn't concern you. It made me more careful, I said, not less willing to try. She studied me for another few seconds. Then she looked at Sora. Something passed between them. Not words. Something in the angle of attention, the slight adjustment of expression. He's the honest kind, Sora said, as if answering a question. I see that, Aleph Vane said. She looked back at me. The material in the conducting pathway is called Verath, she said. It does not occur naturally. It is synthesized through a process that takes approximately 11 years and requires a specific stellar environment we maintain in one of our inner systems. She paused. It is not replaceable quickly. Then my bridge is holding something irreplaceable, I said. For now, yes. How long does my composite give you? She looked at Sora, who was looking at the bird. We don't know, Aleph Vane said. Your composite is unknown to us as well. Something about that sentence landed strangely. Unknown to us, said by someone who controlled 7-star systems. I can write up the composition and synthesis process for you, I said. It's not complicated. The materials are all commercially available in the Kestrel Belt sector, or anything of similar grade. Any competent chemist could reproduce it. Silence. You would give this to us, she said, not quite a question. You're trying to protect something that matters to your daughter, I said. So was I. We want the same thing. The quiet in the room was different after that, denser somehow, like it had more weight. What do you want in return? She said. Nothing. She looked at me with that total, measuring attention. Nothing, she repeated. I'm serious. I fixed the bird because Sora brought it to me and she needed it fixed, and because it was the most interesting engineering problem I'd seen in years. Neither of those things requires payment. Another pause, longer this time. You are an unusual person, Ilith Vane said. I'm a mechanic, I said. We're all a little unusual. And the corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something in that direction. She gave me the Verath specs. That wasn't what I expected, and I didn't fully understand the magnitude of it until later. But she took something from the display she'd been studying when we came in, transferred it to a data chip, and set it on the table in front of me. This is the synthesis record for the specific Verath variant used in Sora's bird, she said. If your composite degrades, you will have what you need to replicate the original material, assuming you can find an analogous stellar environment, which you cannot, but you will have a foundation for approximation. I looked at the chip. That's more than I asked for, I said. You did not ask for anything, she said. This is not equivalent exchange. This is appropriate acknowledgement, she paused. Among my people, a debt of care is settled with knowledge, not currency. You cared for something that belonged to my daughter. We give you something that might be useful to you. Knowledge, I said. Knowledge, she confirmed. What you do with it is yours to decide. I picked up the chip. There's something else, she said. I waited. The repair you made, the bridge, I want to understand it. Not for the bird, for other applications. She looked at me steadily. Your improvisation solved a problem we did not know could be solved this way. That is worth understanding. You want me to walk you through the composite synthesis. I want you to spend 2 hours with my materials scientist, she said. If that is agreeable. I thought about the fuel modulator diagnostic sitting unfinished in the workshop. Then I thought about the bird and the feather segment repair and the way Sora had exhaled when it moved its wings. Yeah, I said, that's agreeable. Her name, the closest approximation my vocal anatomy could manage, was Tev. She was not human, and the specific nature of how she was not human is difficult to describe without veering into either clinical detachment or clumsy overreach. She was approximately my height. She had 4 hands, which I noticed immediately and then forgot about remarkably quickly, because she used them with such matter-of-fact efficiency that they stopped reading as unusual. Her coloring was cool, pale, almost silvery, and her eyes were large, and set at an angle that widened her field of vision considerably. She was the most direct person I had ever met, not rude, direct. She communicated exactly what she meant, in the minimum words necessary, with zero margin for social implication. It was extraordinarily refreshing after years of station politics. Your composite, she said by way of greeting, walk me through it. We stood in what I gathered was her laboratory. A long room filled with equipment I could identify in function, if not always in specific design, which is the mechanical version of understanding a language without knowing all the vocabulary. I walked her through it. The industrial conductive mesh I'd used, grade specifications, tensile properties, the batch variation in conductivity that you had to account for in layering. The thermal buffer compound, what I'd been trying to solve for with it, the heat dissipation issue I'd been working on before I ever met Sora or her bird. The layering technique, how thick, at what temperature, with what curing time. Tev listened and simultaneously worked 4 hands across different pieces of equipment, which should have been distracting but somehow wasn't. Why thermal buffer compound specifically, she said. I was solving for a different problem originally. I needed something that would allow conducting function across a temperature range that standard mesh degrades in. Some of the equipment on this station runs hot enough to compromise standard conductors, especially in the older sections. And the layering stabilizes the mesh, she said. It does, though I'm not fully sure of the mechanism. I arrived at the combination empirically. She paused in her work, looked at me. Empirically, she said, You mean you tried it and it worked? I tried about 8 versions of it before I found one that worked consistently, I said. But yes. Something in her expression shifted in a way I couldn't quite read. You solved for the practical outcome, she said, without deriving the theoretical basis. I'm a mechanic, I said. I usually work the other direction from theorists. She was quiet for a moment, then very precisely. The mechanism is resonance mediation. Your buffer layer is creating a graduated interface that allows the conducting signal to adjust its frequency at the material boundary. You arrived at a solution to a problem in Verath integration that we have been working on theoretically for 40 years. The room was very quiet. 40 years, I said. 40 years, she confirmed. We knew the theoretical gap existed. We had not found the bridge. She paused. You found it because you needed to fix a child's toy and you had the materials available. I sat down on a stool that was too tall for me and thought about that for a minute. That's kind of how most things get solved, I said finally, in my experience. She looked at me for a moment. Then she did something I hadn't expected from someone who communicated with such ruthless efficiency. She laughed. I spent 4 more hours on the ship that day. I went back to the station, slept, came back the next morning because Tev had sent a message through the station comm system that she had follow-up questions. The phrasing of the message was so purely transactional that I found it entirely charming. Eilith Vane I didn't see again that first day. The second morning, she was present in the corridor when I arrived, not waiting, not arranged, just there, crossing from one section to another with 2 of the armored figures beside her. She stopped. How is the work with Tev? She said. Good, I said. She's extraordinary. Yes, she agreed. She is. A pause. She told me you arrived at the resonance mediation solution by accident. By experiment, I said. There's a difference. The corner of her mouth moved again. There is, she said. I know the difference. And then she continued on her way because she was a person who had approximately 17 things of significance to do before midday. Sora found me that second morning. She appeared at the laboratory doorway while Tev and I were working, the bird on her wrist, and she stood there for a moment just looking at the setup. Can I come in? She said. It's your ship, I said. It's Mother's ship, she said. But yes. She came and sat on a stool, one the right height for her, and watched quietly. She was good at watching. She'd inherited that from someone. After a while she said, Are you glad you fixed it? I looked at the bird on her wrist. The repaired wing moved slightly as she shifted her arm, the same fluid, perfect motion as the others. Yeah, I said, I am. Mother says you're unusual, Sora said. She said it like it was important. I'm just a mechanic, I said. Sora looked at me with those amber eyes. She doesn't say things like that about mechanics, she said. I thought about Eilith Vane, the totality of that attention, the way knowledge was currency, the 17-year track record of never losing a campaign. Then I'll take the compliment, I said. Sora nodded. Satisfied, apparently. The bird sang, that chord sound, layered and complex, filling the laboratory with something that was somewhere between music and language. Tev stopped working for exactly 2 seconds to listen. The ship left on the 3rd morning. I knew it was coming. Ships don't stay at Meridian Point. That's not what Meridian Point is for. I'd had 3 days, which was considerably more than most transients. I went to Bay 7 to see them off, which I told myself was just professional courtesy. I'd worked on their ship in a roundabout way. I had an interest in the outcome. That wasn't the real reason. I think Sora knew when she saw me at the edge of the bay. She crossed to me directly. I wanted to say goodbye properly, she said. Not just leave. I appreciate that, I said. The bird was on her wrist. It turned its head and looked at me with eyes I didn't know how to characterize, not glass, not mechanical, not alive in a way I had a word for, something else. If the bridge degrades, I said, the composite spec is on the data chip your mother has. Tev can replicate it. She understood the mechanism better than I do by the end of our second session. I know, Sora said. She told me. A pause. Thank you for that too. That's just professional follow-through, I said. No, it isn't, Sora said, because she was 7 and she had the irritating habit of just being right about things. Eilith Vane was at the top of the ramp. She was not looking toward me. She was looking at a readout one of the armored figures was showing her, something requiring her attention, which at any given moment was probably 14 things. But as I stood there, she looked up. Across the bay, across the distance. She inclined her head, a small, deliberate movement. I did the same. That was the whole of it. No words, no formality, just acknowledgement, clean and complete. Sora looked between us. Told you, she said, not angry. You were right, I said. You're right about most things. I know, she said, but it's nice when people notice. She turned and went up the ramp. The bird sang once, looking back at me, before she crossed the threshold. The bay door sealed. The ship departed. I stood in the empty bay for a while after, looking at the docking clamps and the space where something remarkable had briefly been, and I thought about all the things I hadn't known, and all the things I'd somehow done right anyway. Tomas found me in the diner that afternoon. He sat down without asking, because that's who he was, and he looked at me for a long moment. You went on the ship, he said. Yeah. And came back in one piece. Apparently. He turned his coffee cup. Veith said the diplomatic transit documentation listed unspecified origin. She ran the hull configuration through every database she has access to. He paused. Nothing. I said. You're not going to tell me anything, are you? I'm going to tell you that a kid brought me a broken toy and I fixed it, and then I went and talked to some people about composite materials, and then they left. That's the accurate summary. He stared at me. The toy, he said. It was a bird, very beautiful, very complicated engineering. Marsh. What? He leaned forward. That ship, do you have any idea what it was? I pulled every civilian record, every military database Veith could access, every transit log going back 40 years. Nothing. That configuration doesn't exist in any record. It's not just unknown, it's absent. Like whoever built it didn't want to be found. I thought about what I'd learned in 3 days, about Tev, about Verath, about a woman who gave her daughter a bird made of irreplaceable material, as a statement of belief in the future. I think, I said carefully, that whoever built it is very good at deciding what other people know about them. Tomas stared at me for another few seconds. But they fixed your kid's toy, he said. I fixed their kid's toy, I said. Yeah. He sat back, drank his coffee, processed this for a while. Okay, he said finally, that's something. It really is, I said. Chapter 18, the data chip. I still have the data chip. It's in the second drawer of my workshop, under the magnifying lens. I don't know exactly what to do with it. The Verath synthesis record is extraordinary in an abstract way, a map to a place I have no vehicle to reach. The stellar environment required doesn't exist in human-controlled space, as far as I know. But Tev had said, a foundation for approximation. I've been thinking about what that means, what you do when you have a map to a place you can't go, whether a map still has value when it's showing you something beyond your reach. I think it does. I think maps are how you build the tools you'd need to eventually get there. The composite formula, that one's more immediately practical. I've refined it since. The resonance mediation mechanism Tev identified gave me a framework to understand what I'd been doing empirically, and understanding the mechanism made it possible to optimize the approach. I've filed a provisional technical disclosure with the station engineering record, not patented, not claimed, just documented for anyone who needs it. Tomas says I'm leaving money on the table. He's probably right. I don't care that much. Here's the thing about the bird that I've thought about most. It wasn't a toy. I mean, it was Sarah's, and she was 7, and she loved it the way children love the things that matter most to them, which is completely and without reservation. In that sense, it was a toy. But it was also a statement. Eilith Vane had given it to her daughter at birth, a thing made of irreplaceable material, a thing that sang in a language between music and meaning. A thing that was, by any measure, extraordinarily difficult to make and extraordinarily easy to lose, to damage, to break, to have stolen. She'd given Sora something precious and fragile on purpose. Not because she was careless, because she was teaching her something. I've thought about what that lesson was. I've arrived at this, which I can't verify but which feels right. It was teaching her that the things worth having are worth the risk of losing. That protecting something fragile doesn't mean keeping it locked away. It means learning what it needs, knowing who to trust with it, and being willing to take the burn when the corridor closes wrong, and the choice is between saving yourself and saving what matters. Sora had burned her hand. She hadn't dropped the bird. Then she'd spent 2 days watching a mechanic work before she decided he could be trusted. 7 years old. I don't know what the Keth Dominion is raising her to be. I don't know what Eilith Vane's plans are for the 7-star system she commands, or what they want in the wider galaxy, or how the next century of contact between their civilization and ours is going to go. But I know what the first lesson was. And I know it was a good one. Chapter 20, What I Know Now. I looked up everything I could find on the Keth Dominion after they left, which wasn't much in civilian sources. Fragments, references, the hedged language of academia working at the edge of its knowledge. In one paper, a xenolinguist from the University of New Helsinki had included a translated phrase from a Keth cultural document. The translation was approximate, she warned, and the original concept didn't map cleanly to any human equivalent. The phrase was something like, "The one who repairs what is broken without being asked to understand it is the rarest kind of neighbor." I read that 3 times. Then I printed it and taped it to the wall above my workbench. Not because I thought I deserved the description, but because it seemed like the kind of thing worth trying to be. 6 weeks after they left, I received a transmission. It came through the station's long-range comm relay, the kind of relay that handles diplomatic traffic, flagged with a routing code Veith told me later corresponded to no known origin system. She'd checked. The message was from Sora. It was short. Children's communications usually are, you get the essential information and then you're done, because there's something more immediately interesting happening somewhere else. The bridge is holding. The bird sang this morning for 43 minutes. I timed it. Mother says the composite synthesis is being studied. I am learning the star charts. Mother says the outer systems are very beautiful but very cold. Thank you again for fixing it. Sora. And then, in a different hand, formal, precise, with the kind of deliberateness that goes into every choice of word. The study of your composite material has yielded 3 preliminary insights of theoretical significance. This is not common. We thought you should know. The bridge holds, so does what you did. IV. I read it twice. Then I folded it, printed it first, because some things you need to hold, and put it in the drawer with the data chip. Epilogue, the thing about fixing things. People ask me sometimes, on the long transit route that brought me eventually off Meridian Point and into a wider set of things, People ask me how you get into mechanics. What makes someone choose a life of fixing what's broken? I tell them different versions, depending on who they are. The true version is this. It's about what happens when something doesn't work and you make it work. That's it. There's no bigger philosophy. You have something broken, you apply attention and patience and the right kind of careful force, and if you do it right, it becomes something that works. The satisfaction in that is clean. There's nothing cleaner. I didn't know, when a small girl walked into my workshop holding a broken bird like it was the most important thing she owned, which it was, that I was about to have the most significant encounter of my professional life. I didn't know what was docked in Bay 7 or who had sent her, or what kind of world she came from, or what her mother's name meant in 4 quadrants of the galaxy. I just saw something broken that mattered to someone, and I had the tools and the stubbornness to try. Most things happen that way, in my experience. Most things that end up mattering started as nothing more than, I was there, and I was paying attention, and I didn't walk away. The bird is out there somewhere, crossing distances I can't imagine, singing in the interior of a ship that doesn't appear in any database. It's working. I fixed it. That's enough. That's always been enough.